When he was captured, he weighed 128 pounds. 2 years later, as an American prisoner of war, he weighed 185 pounds. That's a 57-pound weight gain. This is the story of what happened when German soldiers became prisoners of war in America during World War II and discovered a breakfast they literally couldn't believe was real. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about this. We're talking about men who had been fighting in some of the most brutal conditions of the war. Afrika Korps soldiers who had survived the North African desert, Wehrmacht troops who had endured the Eastern Front, sailors from U-boats. And when they arrived in the United States as prisoners, when they sat down for their first American breakfast, many of them thought it was propaganda. They thought it was a trick. Some believed they were being fattened up before execution. Others suspected the food would be taken away after a few days. The reality? It wasn't propaganda. It was Tuesday morning in America. You're going to understand exactly what these men experienced, the specific foods that shocked them to their core, the staggering contrast with how American prisoners were treated in Germany, and why 5,000 German POWs chose to move to America after the war ended. This isn't just about breakfast. It's about what happens when propaganda collides with reality. You're going to understand exactly what these men experienced, the specific foods that shocked them to their core, the staggering contrast with how American prisoners were treated in Germany, and why 5,000 German POWs chose to move to America after the war ended. This isn't just about breakfast. It's about what happens when propaganda collides with reality. Before we dive deep into the scrambled eggs and crisp bacon that changed these men's lives, if you want to understand one of World War II's most fascinating untold stories, tap that like button. It helps other history enthusiasts discover this content, and it tells me you want more deep dives into the human stories behind major historical events. Now, let me set the scene for you. It's 1944. Private Herbert Enslin of the Afrika Korps has just arrived at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. He's exhausted. He's been transported across the Atlantic in a Liberty ship, one of those cargo vessels returning from Europe that could have been attacked by his own side's U-boats. For years, he had been sleeping either inside or on top of his tank in the scorching North African desert. His diet? Whatever the German military could provide, which increasingly meant not much. Black bread that you ate whenever you could get it. Soup from the goulash canon, the cook wagon, that was generally devoid of any visible meat. Potatoes and beans as your principal nutrients when you were lucky. And then he arrives at this American camp. He walks into the mess hall, and what he sees, what he smells, what eventually appears on his plate, he later described it as a dream meal. Not a good meal, not a decent meal, a dream meal. The kind of food he thought only existed in pre-war memories or fantasies. He said, and this is a direct quote, "We had the feeling of being in a Hilton hotel." Think about that comparison for a second. A combat soldier, a prisoner of war, comparing an American military camp to luxury hotel accommodations. He and his fellow prisoners joked among themselves, and this is remarkable, they said, if they had known they would be treated this way, quote, "We would have sneaked across earlier instead of fighting until we ran out of ammunition." Let me be crystal clear about what we're discussing here. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States detained approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war. That's nearly 500,000 men. They were held in roughly 511 to 700 camps spread across 45 to 46 states. This wasn't a small operation. This was a massive undertaking that most Americans today know almost nothing about. And the story of what happened in these camps, particularly when it comes to food, reveals something profound about American society, military culture, and international law during wartime. The centerpiece of this story, the thing that shocked German prisoners more than anything else, was breakfast. Not lunch, not dinner, breakfast. And specifically, an American-style breakfast that included things they hadn't seen in years, if ever. Let me give you the most detailed account we have. This comes from Lieutenant Gerhard Hennes, who was held at Camp Crossville in Tennessee. He later wrote a memoir in 2004 and he described breakfast in specific detail. I want you to listen to exactly what he said, because this is a first-hand primary source. Breakfast included long-forgotten or newly cherished things, like scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange or vape juice, all kinds of cereal, and hotcakes soaked in maple syrup, scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange juice, multiple types of cereal to choose from, and pancakes, hotcakes, as he called them, soaked in maple syrup. For you watching this video right now, that might sound like a standard weekend breakfast. Maybe even a casual weekday breakfast if you have time. For German soldiers who had been eating black bread and thin soup, this was incomprehensible luxury. The bacon alone, crisp bacon, he specified, that was something many of them hadn't tasted in years. Real eggs, not powdered, actually scrambled and served hot. Orange juice squeezed from actual oranges. And maple syrup? That was a purely American product most of them had never experienced. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This wasn't special treatment. This wasn't propaganda meals for inspection day. This was the regular breakfast at American POW camps, served day after day after day because of a very specific legal requirement. The Geneva Convention of 1929, the international treaty that governed treatment of prisoners of war, required the United States to feed German prisoners the same rations as American soldiers. Not similar rations, the same rations. If an American GI was eating scrambled eggs and bacon for breakfast, then German POWs got scrambled eggs and bacon for breakfast. If American troops got coffee with real milk and sugar, German prisoners got coffee with real milk and sugar. And this is where the cultural collision happened. Because what constituted normal military rations for Americans was luxury food for Germans. The United States military fed its troops well, better than most civilian populations in Europe during the war. Americans had access to abundant agricultural production, efficient food distribution, and a military logistics system that could get fresh food to bases across the country. When you applied those same standards to feeding prisoners of war, you created a situation where captured enemy soldiers were eating better than they had ever eaten in their own military. Let me give you another account to drive this home. This one comes from Mississippi POW camps, documented by the State Historical Society. A sample breakfast menu: cereal, toast, cornflakes, jam, coffee, milk, and sugar. That's the breakfast. Typical lunch: roast pork, potato salad, carrots, ice water. Supper: meatloaf, scrambled eggs again, coffee, milk, and bread. Notice something? Meat at multiple meals. Real coffee, not the acorn-based substitute German soldiers drank. Milk, fresh milk available with meals. For men who had been subsisting on ration bread and watery soup, this was almost obscene abundance. Here's another account. This one from Camp Clinton in Mississippi. A prisoner named Helmut described a Sunday menu in detail. Breakfast: milk, cornflakes, specifically Wheaties. He remembered the brand: sugar, bread, coffee, marmalade. Lunch: tomato soup, ribs, potatoes, vegetables, pudding, pastry, tea. This was Sunday, so perhaps slightly better than weekday meals. But the pattern was consistent: multiple courses, meat in substantial portions, dairy products, dessert, coffee and tea freely available. The psychological impact of this food cannot be overstated. Remember, these men had been told by German propaganda that America was a weak, decadent nation, suffering under Jewish capitalism and British imperialism. They expected, if they thought about it at all, to be treated harshly. Many feared execution. Some expected starvation or forced labor under brutal conditions similar to what Soviet prisoners experienced in German camps. Instead, they got pancakes with maple syrup and all the coffee they could drink. And here's the thing that really made them question everything they had been told. The food kept coming. Day after day after food. Day. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a setup. It was just how American military camps operated. They were eating better as prisoners in America than they had eaten as soldiers in the German military. Let that sink in for a moment. Better as prisoners than as soldiers fighting for their own country. Now, I need to show you something that makes this even more striking. While German POWs in America were gaining 57 pounds over 2 years, American POWs in Germany were having the opposite experience. Let me introduce you to Private First Class Ara Dedian. He was part of the 106th Division, captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He described what he ate as a prisoner in Germany. For breakfast, 1 slice of black bread and hot water for coffee, but no coffee, just hot water. For dinner, another slice of bread and a soup that was mostly hot water with some turnip and cabbage parts in it. That's not a metaphor. He said parts, not whole. Vegetables, parts, scraps floating in water. Ara Dedian was about 5 feet 4 inches tall. As a POW in Germany, he lost 50 pounds. German prisoners in America gained 57 pounds. American prisoners in Germany lost 50 pounds. I want you to hold those two numbers in your mind as we continue this story. 57 pounds gained, 50 pounds lost. That's the contrast we're examining. But before we get into the deeper historical context and the Geneva Convention requirements that created this situation, let me ask you to do one more thing. Drop a comment and tell me, did you know about the German POW camps in America? Had you ever heard this story before? I'm genuinely curious because this is one of those historical episodes that should be common knowledge, but somehow isn't. And if you've learned something surprising already, let me know what shocked you most so far. I read every comment, and your engagement helps me understand what historical topics to explore next. We're just getting started. In the next section, I'm taking you deep into the history of how this POW program came to exist, why the United States treated prisoners the way it did, and what the Geneva Convention actually required. You need to understand the historical and legal framework first, because it explains everything that follows. And then I'll break down not just breakfast, but the entire daily food routine, the camp canteens where prisoners could buy Coca-Cola and ice cream, and the American civilians who actually complained that prisoners were eating better than they were while rationing was in effect. This story has layers you won't believe. So why did this happen? How did the United States end up operating what some German POWs later called a golden cage? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning of America's involvement in World War II and trace the development of the POW program from its origins through its peak years. Because this wasn't accidental. This was deliberate policy based on international law, military strategy, and American values, even when those values conflicted with public opinion. The story begins with the Geneva Convention of 1929. This was an international treaty signed by major world powers in the aftermath of World War I, when the treatment of prisoners had been inconsistent and often brutal. The convention established clear rules. Prisoners of war must be housed in conditions comparable to the detaining power's own military. They must be fed the same rations as the detaining power's troops. They must be paid wages. They can be required to work, but not in dangerous conditions or in support of military operations against their own country. And critically, they must be protected from violence, intimidation, and reprisals. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, it was a signatory to this convention. That meant America had a legal obligation to treat prisoners according to these standards. But there was more to it than just legal compliance. American military leadership and political leaders believed strongly in following international law, partly because they knew American soldiers would be taken prisoner, and they wanted to set a reciprocal standard. If America treated German prisoners well, perhaps Germany would treat American prisoners well. This didn't always work, as we saw with Ara Dedian losing 50 pounds in a German camp, but it was part of the strategic calculation. The first German POWs arrived in the United States in 1942, but the real influx began in 1943 as the Allies gained the upper hand in North Africa. After the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, tens of thousands of German and Italian prisoners needed to be housed somewhere. Britain couldn't hold them all. It was already crowded, under bombing attacks, and dealing with food shortages. The solution was to ship prisoners across the Atlantic to the United States, which had vast land, abundant resources, and was far from the combat zones. The numbers grew rapidly. By the peak period from 1943 to 1945, up to 30,000 POWs were arriving in America every month. 30,000 per month. The U.S. Army had to rapidly construct or designate camps across the country. Eventually, as I mentioned earlier, somewhere between 511 and 700 camps operated in 45 to 46 states. These weren't all massive facilities. Many were smaller branch camps attached to a larger base camp. They were built near farms, forests, and factories because the prisoners would be put to work. We'll get to that shortly. The transportation itself was part of the story. German POWs were shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships, those mass-produced cargo vessels that were the backbone of Allied logistics. These were the same ships bringing supplies to Europe, now returning with human cargo. And here's something remarkable. The good treatment began on the ships. POWs received substantial meals during the voyage. This wasn't cruelty followed by sudden kindness. From the moment of capture, particularly once they were in American custody, the policy was consistent, humane treatment according to Geneva Convention standards. Now let's talk about what those standards meant in practice. The United States military decided that the Geneva Convention requirement to feed prisoners the same as American soldiers meant exactly that. The same food, prepared the same way, in the same quantities. This was not universally popular with American civilians. Remember, this is wartime America. Rationing was in effect. Civilians had ration books and could only purchase limited quantities of meat, butter, sugar, coffee, and other staples. Americans were being asked to sacrifice for the war effort, to grow victory gardens, to conserve resources. And then they found out that German prisoners, enemy soldiers who had been killing American boys just weeks or months earlier, were eating steak, drinking real coffee, and getting butter with their bread. The complaints were loud and frequent, but military leadership held firm. The law was clear, the policy was set, and frankly, there were practical reasons beyond legality and ethics. First, well-fed prisoners were healthier and could work more effectively, and the POWs were working. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to be employed in non-military labor, and America desperately needed workers. Millions of American men were in uniform overseas. Farms needed harvest labor. Forests needed logging crews. Some factories needed workers. German POWs filled these gaps. They were paid 80 cents per day, equivalent to about $15 in 2024 currency. That doesn't sound like much, but remember, they had no living expenses. Housing and food were provided. That 80 cents per day could be spent entirely on extras at the camp canteen. And this brings us to one of the most striking aspects of the POW experience in America: the canteens. These were camp stores where prisoners could purchase items using their wages. What could they buy? Ice cream, Coca-Cola, beer? Cigarettes actually sold cheaper inside the camp than outside because there was no tax. Snacks, toiletries, writing materials, hobby supplies. Think about that for a moment. Enemy prisoners of war buying ice cream and Coca-Cola with money they earned from voluntary work. Now let me give you a sense of how widespread this system was. These camps weren't concentrated in one region. They were deliberately spread across the country. You had camps in Texas and Oklahoma, where prisoners worked in agriculture and oil fields. Camps in Wisconsin and Minnesota, where they worked in lumber and dairy farms. Camps in the deep South Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, where they picked cotton and worked in forestry. Camps in the Northeast and Northwest, even a camp in Montana. The variety was intentional. The military wanted to distribute prisoners so no single region bore the burden. They also wanted to place prisoners near the labor they would perform. A camp near timber country meant forestry work. A camp near farmland meant agricultural work. Some camps were temporary, operating only during harvest season. Others were permanent installations that operated for years. The physical conditions of the camps varied. but they all met basic standards. Barracks with bunks, heated in winter, ventilated in summer, mess halls with kitchen facilities, latrines and washing facilities, recreational areas with sports fields. Some camps had libraries. Many had workshops where prisoners could practice trades or crafts. The larger base camps often had medical facilities with German POW doctors treating their fellow prisoners under American supervision. This infrastructure represented a massive investment, building 500 camps, staffing them with American guards, feeding 425,000 men, administering the work programs, maintaining security. All of this required resources and organization at a time when America was fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The fact that the system worked as well as it did says something about American logistical capability and institutional commitment to following international law. I want to share a specific account that captures this perfectly. This is from Günter Graue, who was interviewed in 2017 at age 91. He recalled being at the POW camp at Fort Lewis in Washington State in August or September 1944. He was a young man, probably about 18 years old at the time, and he remembered standing in front of the camp shop considering what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola? Never before. So I decided to take both, an ice cream or a Coca-Cola." That was his dilemma as a prisoner of war. Not will I eat today, but which American treat do I want first? The contrast with what was happening in Europe at that same moment, the summer of 1944, is almost incomprehensible. The war was still raging. Americans were dying on Normandy beaches and in Italian mountains. German cities were being bombed. Civilians across Europe were starving. The Holocaust was in full operation. And in a POW camp in Washington State, a young German soldier was deciding between ice cream and Coca-Cola. Now, I need to address something important here. This good treatment wasn't universal, and it wasn't without conditions. Treatment varied significantly depending on the location and the camp management. Some camp commanders were stricter than others. Some camps were in remote areas where prisoners had less interaction with local communities. And there were rules. Prisoners couldn't just wander freely. They were still confined. Escape attempts were punished. And after 1945, when American soldiers liberated Nazi concentration camps and filmed the horrific evidence of the Holocaust, American attitudes toward German POWs hardened considerably. The military began showing these Holocaust films to German prisoners. The goal was denazification, forcing them to confront what their country had done. After these screenings, food quality was deliberately reduced. Though still within Geneva Convention requirements, the unlimited seconds were stopped. The generous portions were scaled back. It wasn't starvation, but it was a message. You don't get to pretend none of this happened while enjoying American abundance. But for the majority of the war, from 1942 through early 1945, the standard experience for German POWs in America was remarkably good. They ate the same food as American GIs. They worked for wages. They had access to recreation, sports, theater groups, chess, libraries. Some camps had educational programs. Mail was allowed, though censored and delayed. Religious services were provided. For many prisoners, especially those captured early in the war, their years in American camps were safer and more comfortable than their years in the German military had been. Let me give you a comparison that really drives this home. The German military ration for prisoners they held, American or British prisoners, consisted of 9 pounds of potatoes per week, 5 pounds of bread, 2.5 pounds of cabbage, plus small amounts of sausage, sugar, salt, barley, and fake coffee made from acorns. 9 pounds of potatoes and 5 pounds of bread per week, that's the bulk of your calories. Cabbage for vegetables, fake coffee. Compare that to scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange, juice, pancakes with maple syrup, roast pork, potato salad, meatloaf, and real coffee with milk and sugar. Arnold Kramer, who is the leading academic expert on German POWs in America. He's a professor at Texas A&M University and wrote the definitive scholarly work on this topic. He interviewed hundreds of former German POWs over decades of research. And he noted this pattern: I've yet to meet a German prisoner who doesn't tell me that it was the time of their lives. The time of their lives as prisoners in an enemy country during a brutal world war. That statement might make you uncomfortable. It should. It reveals something profound about the gap between what these men expected and what they experienced. They expected, at best, harsh treatment within the bounds of international law. Many expected worse: starvation, brutality, perhaps death. Instead, they got 3 meals a day, recreational activities, wages, and the opportunity to buy ice cream. But there's another side to this story that we need to examine. What did this experience do to these men psychologically? How did it affect their view of America, of Germany, of the Nazi propaganda they had been fed? We know that after repatriation, about 5,000 Germans out of 425,000, so roughly 1%, chose to emigrate to the United States. They went through the process of returning to Germany, dealing with the post-war chaos and reconstruction, and then making the decision to leave their homeland and move to America. Why? What was it about their POW experience that made them want to become Americans? That's what we're exploring in the next section. But first, I want you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Here's why. I'm creating an entire series on untold stories from World War II, the human experiences that get lost in the big narratives about battles and generals. Stories like this one, where the details reveal something unexpected about culture, policy, and human nature. If you found this deep dive into POW food rations fascinating, you'll want to see what I'm uncovering next. And hitting that bell ensures you don't miss it. Now let's get into the most detailed breakdown I can give you of exactly what German POWs ate in American camps. I want to walk through an entire day, meal by meal, so you can fully understand the shock these men experienced. Let's start with breakfast, since that's where we began this whole story. I've already shared Lieutenant Gerhard Hennis's description from Camp Crossville: scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange or vate juice, all kinds of cereal, and hot cakes soaked in maple syrup. But I want to break down each element of that meal and explain why it was so significant. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, cooked fresh. In Germany, eggs had become scarce luxury items by the middle of the war. The German military used powdered eggs when they could get them. Fresh eggs were rare. In American POW camps, fresh eggs were standard breakfast fare several times a week. The prisoners would see eggs prepared in large quantities in the mess hall kitchen. No hiding what they were getting. No mystery powder being reconstituted. Actual eggs cracked from actual shells, scrambled with milk and butter, seasoned with salt and pepper, served hot, crisp bacon. Hennis specifically remembered that the bacon was crisp. That detail tells you something. This wasn't limp, undercooked, or fatty bacon. It was prepared properly, cooked until the fat rendered and the meat crisped. Bacon requires a lot of fat, and fat was one of the most rationed commodities in wartime economies. German civilians and soldiers rarely saw real bacon. The American military had so much pork production that bacon was a standard breakfast item. POWs got the same bacon American GIs got, cooked the same way. Fresh orange juice, or vate. Let's think about what this means. Oranges are grown in Florida, California, and Texas. They need to be harvested, transported, and processed. Fresh orange juice means someone juiced oranges that morning, or juice was produced recently and kept refrigerated. Vate vegetable juice was a commercial product, a blend of tomato and other vegetable juices. Either option, fresh squeezed orange juice or bottled vate, represented a level of logistics and abundance that most of the world couldn't imagine in 1943 or 1944. German soldiers in North Africa or Russia weren't getting fresh juice of any kind. They were lucky to get clean water, all kinds of cereal, not one cereal, multiple options. Hennis remembered this variety specifically. Cornflakes, which were invented by Kellogg in America. Wheaties, which another prisoner specifically named other grain-based cereals. Served with fresh milk and sugar, you could choose which one you wanted. Choice that's a luxury in itself. In military rations, you usually eat what you're given. But American POW camps apparently offered variety at the breakfast cereal selection. Hot cakes soaked in maple syrup. Pancakes, made from scratch or from mix, cooked on griddles in the camp kitchen, served hot with real maple syrup. Maple syrup is produced from maple trees, primarily in the northeastern United States and Canada. It was an authentic American product that most Germans had never tasted. The sweetness, the flavor, the ritual of pouring it over pancakes, this was purely American food culture. And it was being served to prisoners. Now, let's talk about the coffee. Multiple accounts mention coffee specifically, and they mention it with milk and sugar available. This is crucial context. Germany didn't have coffee. They had Ersatzkaffee, substitute coffee, made from roasted acorns, chicory, barley, or other grains. It was bitter and had no caffeine. It was coffee in name only. Real coffee came from tropical regions, Latin America, Africa, required shipping across oceans. Germany didn't have secure shipping routes. America did. American military coffee wasn't gourmet, but it was real coffee, brewed strong, served hot, with milk and sugar on the side. For German soldiers who had been drinking acorn water for years, real coffee was almost as shocking as the bacon and eggs. Let's move to lunch, the midday meal. From the Mississippi camps, we have a documented typical lunch: roast pork, potato salad, carrots, and ice water. Roast pork. That's a substantial cut of meat, roasted until cooked through, probably served in slices. Pork was plentiful in American agriculture. Potato salad: potatoes, boiled and dressed with mayonnaise or vinegar, onions, sometimes celery, served cold, carrots as a side vegetable, and ice water, not just water, but chilled water, which means the camp had ice production or refrigeration. Another lunch example from Camp Clinton included tomato soup, ribs, potatoes, vegetables, pudding, pastry, and tea. Let's examine this. Tomato soup as a starter course. Ribs, that's pork ribs or beef ribs. Meat cooked on the bone, which tends to be flavorful and satisfying. Potatoes prepared some way, mashed, boiled, or baked. Other vegetables. And then dessert, pudding and pastry. Dessert at lunch, not on special occasions, on a regular day. And tea available for those who preferred it to coffee. The pattern you're seeing here is abundance and variety. Multiple courses. Meat at every meal, or nearly every meal. Carbohydrates from bread, potatoes, pasta, vegetables, though probably not the most exciting vegetables, carrots, cabbage, green beans, whatever was available and easy to prepare in quantity. Desserts frequently. Real coffee and tea. Fresh milk, butter and margarine, salt and pepper and other seasonings. Now, let's look at dinner, the evening meal. From Mississippi camps, meatloaf, scrambled eggs, coffee, milk, and bread. Meatloaf is ground beef or pork mixed with breadcrumbs and seasonings, formed into a loaf and baked. It's economical because you can stretch meat with filler, but it's still substantial protein. The fact that they served scrambled eggs at dinner as well as breakfast shows how much egg supply they had, and again, coffee and milk freely available. I want to pause here and give you a sense of scale. These camps weren't serving a dozen people. Some of the larger camps held thousands of prisoners. Camp Crossville in Tennessee held over 3,000 at its peak. Preparing breakfast for 3,000 people, scrambling enough eggs, cooking enough bacon, making enough pancakes, brewing enough coffee, that's industrial-scale food production. The logistics behind feeding 425,000 prisoners across hundreds of camps, day after day for years, is staggering. And the United States military did it while also feeding millions of American troops deployed worldwide and maintaining civilian food supplies at home. Let me share one more detailed menu to really drive this home. This is a Sunday menu from Camp Clinton, documented by a prisoner named Helmut. Breakfast: milk, cornflakes, specifically Wheaties brand, sugar, bread, coffee, and marmalade. Lunch: tomato soup, ribs, potatoes, vegetables, pudding, pastry, and tea. This was Sunday, perhaps a slightly better menu than weekdays, but the weekday menus we have are also substantial. The Sunday element might have been the ribs instead of a less expensive cut, or the inclusion of both pudding and pastry for dessert. Now here's something that happened that shows you how abundant the food was. POWs at some camps couldn't eat everything they were served. American portion sizes, American meal frequency, the sheer amount of food it was more than they could consume, especially at first. And they started burning leftover food. Why? Because they feared that if the Americans saw they couldn't eat it all, rations would be reduced. They thought the generous portions were some kind of test, so they would secretly burn or bury leftover food to hide the fact that they were being given more than they needed. Eventually, they realized the food wasn't going to be reduced. This was just how American camps operated. The portions stayed large, the quality remained high, and they stopped burning food and started, in many cases, gaining significant weight. Remember that 57-pound weight gain over 2 years? That wasn't unusual. Many prisoners returned to Germany noticeably heavier than when they were captured. But wait, there's more. And this is where it gets almost absurd from a historical perspective. The POWs had access to camp canteens, camp stores, where they could spend their wages. 80 cents per day doesn't sound like much, but remember, all their basic needs were met. That 80 cents was pure discretionary spending. And what did the canteen sell? Ice cream. Multiple accounts mention ice cream. Specifically, Günter Grohe's dilemma about buying ice cream or Coca-Cola. Ice cream requires dairy, sugar, refrigeration or freezing, and manufacturing capability. It's a luxury product even in peacetime. During the war, with rationing in effect, many American civilians couldn't get ice cream easily, but POW camp canteens sold it. Coca-Cola, the quintessential American soft drink. Sweet, carbonated, caffeinated. It had to be bottled and shipped to camps. POWs could buy it cold from the canteen. Some of them, like Greo, had never tasted it before. It was a purely American cultural product, and they could buy it with their prisoner wages. Beer. Yes, beer. Alcohol was available for purchase in at least some camps. Not hard liquor, but beer, which was seen as a relatively harmless beverage. German culture had a strong beer drinking tradition, so this was familiar but still surprising that captors would allow it. Cigarettes, sold cheaper inside the camp than outside, because there was no tax. Smoking was extremely common in the 1940s. Making tobacco available kept prisoners content and gave them something to do with their wages. Snacks, candy, toiletries, writing materials, hobby supplies. POWs could buy chocolate bars, chewing gum, soap, shaving supplies, paper and pens, materials for crafts or art projects. Some camps had extensive craft programs where prisoners made furniture, artwork, or other items, both for personal use and for sale. Let me give you a sense of what this looked like from a prisoner's perspective. You wake up in the morning in a barrack that, while not luxurious, is weatherproof, heated in winter, and comparable to American military housing. You go to the mess hall and get scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee with milk and sugar. You work for several hours, maybe agricultural work in fields, maybe forestry, maybe maintenance around the camp. The work isn't brutal. It's supervised but not slave labor. You break for lunch, soup, a meat dish, vegetables, bread, dessert. You work a few more hours. You return to camp. You might play soccer or volleyball. Sports equipment was provided. You might attend an educational class or a theater rehearsal. Many camps had active cultural programs. You go to dinner, another substantial meal with meat, starches, vegetables. After dinner, you might go to the canteen and buy an ice cream or a Coke. You might write a letter home, though it will be censored and take months to arrive. You might play cards or chess with other prisoners. Then you sleep. That's not a hellish prisoner of war experience. That's a structured, safe, adequately fed daily routine. It's boring, certainly. You're separated from family and home. You're confined. You can't leave. But you're not suffering. You're not being brutalized. You're not starving. You're not freezing. You're alive, healthy, and relatively comfortable. Now contrast that with what German military life had been like for many of these men. If you were in the Afrika Korps, you fought in the North African desert from 1941 to 1943. Extreme heat, limited water, supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, constantly attacked by Allied forces. Food was whatever could be shipped or captured. When Rommel's forces advanced, they sometimes captured Allied supplies and ate British or American rations, which they considered superior to their own. When they retreated, food became scarce. If you were on the Eastern Front, conditions were even worse. Brutal winter cold, summer heat and mud. Supply lines stretched 1,000 miles back to Germany through hostile territory filled with partisans. Food shortages were chronic. German soldiers often subsisted on whatever they could forage or steal from occupied territories. If you were in a U-boat, you lived in a cramped metal tube underwater for weeks or months at a time. The food started fresh but quickly became moldy and spoiled in the bingen, damp conditions. By the end of a patrol, you were eating whatever was left that wasn't completely rotten. And then you become a prisoner in America, and you get bacon and eggs for breakfast. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. These men had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was weak, that Americans were soft, that the German military was superior in every way. And yet, the evidence in front of them, on their breakfast plates, in the camp canteen, in the treatment they received, contradicted everything they had been taught. America wasn't weak. America had so much abundance that it could feed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners the same quality food as its own soldiers. America had such strong principles that it followed international law even when its own civilians complained. America had such efficient logistics that it could deliver ice cream to POW camps in remote areas, while also supplying a global war effort. Some prisoners began to question their beliefs. If the propaganda about America was wrong, what else was wrong? If Americans weren't the enemy that German radio described, then who was the real enemy? These questions became more urgent in 1945 when the Holocaust footage was shown in camps. Suddenly, the moral equation became clear. They had been fighting for an evil regime. America, the nation they had been told was decadent and corrupt, was actually the one following the rules, treating prisoners humanely, and upholding international law. Before we move into the long-term impacts and the stories of POWs who returned to America after the war, I want you to hit that notification bell if you haven't already. The next section gets into the most emotionally powerful parts of this story, including the account of Günter Grayo returning to America at age 91 to say thank you. You don't want to miss that. But first, let me address something I know some of you are thinking. Was this fair? Should German POWs have been treated this well when German forces were committing atrocities? When American soldiers were dying? When American civilians were under rationing? These are legitimate questions. The answer American military and political leaders gave was, yes, it's fair, because we're following the law, because we want to set a reciprocal standard for how our soldiers are treated, and because maintaining our principles even toward enemies is what separates us from totalitarian regimes. Not everyone agreed with that answer then, and you might not agree with it now. But that was the policy, and it was maintained throughout the war with few exceptions. And as we'll see in the next section, it had profound long-term effects that extended well beyond the war years. Now we get to the part of the story that reveals the true long-term impact of this POW experience. Because the story doesn't end when the war ends. It doesn't end when prisoners are repatriated to Germany. Effects rippled forward for decades, shaping individual lives, influencing post-war German-American relations, and creating bonds that lasted lifetimes. Let's start with the numbers. After repatriation between 1945 and 1946, approximately 5,000 former German POWs chose to emigrate to the United States. Think about what that means. These men returned to Germany, dealt with the post-war chaos, cities destroyed, economy collapsed, occupation zones divided among Allied powers, families scattered or killed, and then made the decision to leave their homeland and move to America. Why would they do that? The most obvious answer is economic opportunity. Post-war Germany was devastated. Jobs were scarce, housing was scarce, food was scarce. America, by contrast, was entering the greatest economic boom in its history. Jobs were plentiful for those willing to work. The men who had spent years in American POW camps had learned English, understood American culture, had developed work skills that American employers valued, and knew that life in America offered opportunities they couldn't find in ruined Germany. But there was more to it than just economics. Many of these men had positive memories of their POW experience. I know how strange that sounds. Positive memories of being a prisoner. But remember what we've discussed. They were treated well. They were fed abundantly. They were paid for work. They lived safely while the war raged. Some formed friendships with American guards or civilian workers. Some fell in love with the American landscape, the vast spaces, the farms and forests they worked in, the small towns they saw from the camps. Hans Weicker, a former POW who was 88 years old when interviewed, eventually settled in Maine. He said directly, "Our treatment was excellent." Many POWs complained about being POWs, no girlfriends, no contact with family, but the food was excellent and clothing adequate. He specifically mentioned the food as excellent, not adequate, not sufficient, excellent. The man spent the rest of his life in Maine, decades after the war, and still remembered the quality of POW camp food. But let me share the most emotionally powerful account I found in researching this topic. This is the story of Günter Graue, the man who couldn't decide between ice cream and Coca-Cola in 1944. In 2017, at age 91, Graue traveled back to the United States, specifically to thank America for how he was treated as a prisoner of war, 91 years old. 73 years after his POW experience, he came back. The U.S. Army interviewed him during this return visit, and his words are striking. He said, "I think of the prisoners of ISIS. They won't get ice cream or Coca-Cola. My stay here was the best treatment I've had." Think about that comparison. He's watching news coverage of modern conflicts, seeing how terrorist groups treat prisoners, and comparing it to his experience in 1944. And his conclusion is that his time as a POW in America was the best treatment he'd experienced in his entire life. Not good treatment, not fair treatment, the best treatment. What drives a 91-year-old man to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to thank a country for something that happened when he was 18? Gratitude, obviously, but also a recognition that what happened to him was extraordinary. He understood, probably better with the perspective of age than he did at 18, how unusual his experience was. He knew that prisoners in other conflicts, in other wars, under other systems, suffered terribly, and he wanted to acknowledge that America had done something different. Graue's story represents something larger than one individual's gratitude. It represents the long-term effects of treating prisoners humanely. When you treat people with dignity, even enemies, even when you're not required to go beyond minimum standards, you create lasting impressions that reshape attitudes and relationships. Those German POWs who returned to America, who settled here, who raised families here, they became ambassadors in their own way. They told their stories. They contradicted the old propaganda. They demonstrated through their own lives that American values weren't just rhetoric. Let me give you another data point that shows the psychological impact. There was a chaplain named Alex Funke. who corresponded with 80 fellow prisoners after repatriation. He reported that they had become, quote, convinced Democrats, end quote, due to their treatment as POWs. Convinced Democrats. These were men who had fought for Nazi Germany, who had been raised in an authoritarian system, who had been taught that democracy was weak and decadent. And the experience of American captivity converted them to democratic values. How did that happen? Through daily experience. They saw American guards who followed rules. They saw a system that had checks and balances. They saw that even prisoners had rights that couldn't be arbitrarily violated. They saw abundance created by free markets and democratic governance. They saw newspapers and magazines, even if censored. They saw that Americans debated and disagreed openly. They saw that authority could be questioned. And slowly, for some of them, the lived experience of democracy, even from the position of prisoners, was more convincing than any propaganda speech. This is one of the untold stories of post-war denazification. We talk about war crimes trials, about occupation policy, about re-education programs, but we talk less about the subtle, daily process of demonstrating through action what democracy and rule of law actually mean. Those POW camps, with their regular meals and Geneva Convention compliance and fair treatment, were teaching democracy more effectively than any lecture could. Now, I need to acknowledge complexity here. Not every German POW became a democratic convert. Some remained committed Nazis. Some camps had significant problems with hardcore Nazi prisoners, intimidating or attacking others who expressed doubts about the regime. After the war, some former POWs returned to Germany and participated in the far-right political movements that emerged. The POW experience didn't magically transform everyone, but the overall trend is clear. German POWs in America generally had positive experiences, and those experiences shaped their post-war attitudes. Scholar Arnold Kramer, who spent decades researching this topic and interviewed hundreds of former POWs, consistently found that their time in America left lasting positive impressions. His statement that he had yet to meet a German prisoner who didn't consider it the time of their lives is remarkable precisely because it's so consistent. Let me shift to another aspect of the long-term impact: the effect on American communities. Remember, these POW camps were spread across 45 states. They were often in rural areas, near farms and small towns. Local Americans interacted with the prisoners. Farmers hired them for harvest work. Townspeople saw them at work sites. In some cases, friendships developed. There are documented cases of American families inviting German POWs to their homes for holiday meals. There are cases of romantic relationships between German prisoners and American women, though these were prohibited and caused scandal when discovered. In the decades after the war, as former POWs came back to visit or emigrate, they often returned to the communities where they had been imprisoned. They reconnected with Americans they'd known. They showed their families where they had lived. Historical societies and museums began documenting these POW camps and collecting oral histories. Towns that had camps started holding reunions where former POWs and their American guards could meet again, now as friends rather than captive. There's something profound happening in these reunions: enemies becoming friends, captors and prisoners sharing memories and meals. The war receding into history, while the human relationships formed during that time persist. This is reconciliation at the personal level, happening organically, because the initial relationship, even though it was between prisoner and guard, was built on mutual respect and humane treatment. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates this. At Camp Crossville in Tennessee, where Gerhard Hennis remembered the bacon and eggs, the campsite is now a historical landmark. The state of Tennessee has preserved buildings and created interpretive exhibits. Former POWs and their families have visited. They've donated artifacts and documents. They've shared their stories with historians. The narrative isn't Germany as enemy or Americans as conquerors. The narrative is shared history, mutual experience, and the bonds formed even in conflict. This pattern repeats across the country. In Mississippi, The Historical Society has documented multiple POW camps and collected extensive oral histories. In Fort Lewis, Washington, where Gunter Gray bought his ice cream and Coca-Cola, the military base museum includes POW camp history. These aren't shameful secrets hidden away. They're acknowledged as part of the complex story of World War II on the American home front. Now let's talk about something that happened after 1945 that shows the limits of this good treatment. When American troops began liberating Nazi concentration camps in the spring of 1945, they documented what they found. The films and photographs of Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps showed the world the full horror of the Holocaust. Mass graves, starved survivors who looked like skeletons, gas chambers, and crematoriums, evidence of systematic mass murder. The American military decided that German POWs needed to see this evidence. They wanted to counter any claims of propaganda or exaggeration. They wanted to make clear what regime these men had fought for. So they screened the documentary films in POW camps across America. The reactions varied. Some prisoners were shocked and genuinely horrified, claiming they had never known about the camps. Some were skeptical, suggesting the films were faked Allied propaganda. Some were defensive, arguing that they had just been following orders. Some were silent. After these screenings, American policy toward the POWs hardened. Food quality was deliberately reduced. Though still within Geneva Convention minimums, the unlimited portions were stopped. The generous attitude shifted to a more stern, punitive approach. The message was clear. You don't get to enjoy American abundance while pretending you knew nothing about the concentration camps. This wasn't cruelty, but it was a calculated withdrawal of some of the extras that had made camp life comfortable. This policy shift reveals something important. The good treatment of German POWs wasn't unconditional. It was based on following international law and maintaining American principles. But once the Holocaust evidence became undeniable, there was a moral reckoning. Americans, both military officials and civilians, felt that allowing German prisoners to live too comfortably while evidence of genocide was emerging was wrong, so they adjusted. Not to the point of abuse or starvation, but enough to make the point that this was still punishment, still imprisonment, still a consequence of fighting for an evil regime. This is one area where the rosy narrative of well-fed POWs needs qualification. Yes, treatment was generally good by historical standards. Yes, most prisoners had adequate food, shelter, and safety. But there was also a darker context. The Holocaust was happening. American soldiers were dying, civilians were suffering, and the decision to treat prisoners well was contested and conditional. When the moral calculus shifted after the liberation of concentration camps, policy shifted too. Let me bring this section to a close with one more perspective. Private First Class Era de Dion, the American soldier who lost 50 pounds in a German POW camp, survived the war and returned home. His experience was the mirror image of what German POWs experienced in America. He endured near starvation, minimal shelter, disease, and the constant threat of death. When American POW survivors came home and learned that German prisoners in America had been eating bacon and eggs while they starved in Germany, many were angry. They felt betrayed. They questioned why their own country had treated the enemy better than the enemy treated Americans. The answer, as I've explained, was Geneva Convention compliance and reciprocal standard setting. But that answer didn't satisfy everyone then, and it might not satisfy you now. War creates impossible moral situations. Do you treat enemies well in hopes they'll reciprocate, even when you know they're not reciprocating? Do you maintain your principles, even when the other side doesn't? Do you follow the law even when public opinion demands revenge? America chose to follow the law. That decision had costs: public anger, questions about fairness, the difficult optics of well-fed German prisoners, while Americans sacrificed. But it also had benefits. It demonstrated American values. It created opportunities for denazification. It built long-term relationships that served post-war reconciliation. Gunter Gray, Returning at age 91 to say thank you is one example of those long-term benefits. Whether that trade-off was worth it is something you'll have to decide for yourself. But the story itself, the bacon, the eggs, the coffee, the ice cream, the 57-pound weight gain, the 5,000 emigrants, the convinced Democrats, the 91-year-old man saying thank you, that story is undeniably fascinating and historically significant. If this deep dive into the complex moral and human dimensions of POW treatment has given you new perspectives, share this video with someone who loves World War II history. And check the description where I've linked additional resources about German POWs in America, including museum collections and oral history archives. This is history that deserves to be remembered. Now, let's bring this all together with a comprehensive recap and talk about what this story means for us today. Let's recap everything you've learned in the past hour, because this is a story with many layers and all of them matter. You started by learning about the shocking 57-pound weight gain of a German POW over 2 years in American custody. You heard about Private Herbert Enslin calling his first American meal a dream meal and comparing the camp to a Hilton hotel. You discovered that German prisoners joked they would have surrendered earlier if they'd known they'd be treated so well. Then you learned the historical context. 425,000 German POWs held in 511 to 700 camps across 45 to 46 states from 1942 to 1946. The Geneva Convention of 1929 requiring prisoners to receive the same rations as the captor's own military. The decision by American military leadership to strictly follow that requirement, feeding German POWs the same food as American GIs. You discovered exactly what that meant for breakfast. Lieutenant Gerhard Hennis's detailed account: scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange or vate juice, all kinds of cereal, and hot cakes soaked in maple syrup. Real eggs, not powdered. Crisp bacon with proper fat rendering. Fresh juice, multiple cereal options. Pancakes with real maple syrup. Real coffee with milk and sugar, not the acorn substitute German soldiers drank. You learned about lunch and dinner menus: roast pork, potato salad, carrots, tomato soup, ribs, potatoes, vegetables, pudding, pastry, meatloaf, scrambled eggs, bread, multiple courses, meat at nearly every meal, desserts regularly, abundant portions that some prisoners couldn't finish, and burned or buried because they feared rations would be reduced. You discovered the camp canteens where prisoners could spend their 80-cent daily wages: ice cream and Coca-Cola, beer and cigarettes, snacks and hobby supplies. Gunter Graewe's dilemma: ice cream or Coke? His decision? Both. The cultural experience of American abundance available for purchase with prisoner wages. You learned the striking contrast. American POW era de Dion. In Germany, 1 slice of black bread and hot water for breakfast, soup with turnip and cabbage parts for dinner, 50-pound weight loss. German POWs in America: bacon, eggs, coffee, pancakes, 57-pound weight gain. The same war, 2 completely different prisoner experiences. You explored the long-term impacts. 5,000 German POWs emigrating to America after repatriation. Former prisoners becoming convinced Democrats due to their treatment. Gunter Graue returning at age 91 to thank America, saying it was the best treatment he'd ever had. The subtle denazification that happened through daily experience of democracy and rule of law. You learned about American civilian complaints that German prisoners ate better than rationed civilians. You learned about the policy shift after Holocaust films were shown, when food was reduced and attitudes hardened. You learned that this good treatment was contested, conditional, and existed in the morally complex context of a brutal war and genocide. And now you understand that this story isn't just about food. It's about the power of principles, even in wartime. It's about the long-term effects of humane treatment. It's about the gap between propaganda and reality. It's about how daily experience can change minds more effectively than any speech. It's about the complicated moral questions that war creates and the difficult choices leaders must make. So what does this mean for us today? What can we learn from the story of German POWs eating bacon and eggs in American camps? First, institutions and nations are judged by how they treat those in their power, especially enemies and those who cannot defend themselves. America chose to follow the Geneva Convention strictly, even when it was unpopular, even when it seemed unfair, even when the enemy wasn't reciprocating. That choice demonstrated values more powerfully than any propaganda. Those values impressed even the prisoners who were subject to them. Günter Grohe remembered for 73 years. That's the power of principled action. When you maintain standards even under pressure, even when it costs something, even when others aren't watching, that's when your values become real and visible and persuasive. Second, abundance and opportunity are powerful forces for changing minds. German POWs came to America expecting harsh treatment. They found bacon, eggs, coffee, and ice cream. That material abundance, combined with humane treatment, made many of them question everything they'd been taught about America and democracy. You can't propagandize away someone's lived experience. When they see and taste and feel abundance and fairness, propaganda loses its power. This is a lesson that applies beyond prisoner camps. People judge systems by results. If democratic capitalism produces bacon and eggs for everyone, including prisoners, while authoritarianism produces black bread and acorn coffee, people notice. Material conditions matter. Quality of life matters. And direct experience trumps ideology every time. Third, the long-term effects of how we treat people during conflict extend far beyond the immediate situation. Those 5,000 German emigrants, those convinced Democrats, that 91-year-old man returning to say, "Thank you." Those weren't immediate war aims. Nobody in 1943 was thinking about post-war German-American friendship when they decided to serve scrambled eggs to POWs. But the humane treatment created conditions for reconciliation that served American interests for decades afterward. This is strategic thinking at the highest level, understanding that how you treat people today shapes relationships for generations. The seeds planted in POW camps during the war grew into post-war alliances, trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and mutual understanding that benefited both nations for the rest of the century. Fourth, moral complexity is real, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. This story has uncomfortable elements. American POWs starving in Germany, while German POWs gained weight in America. American civilians under rationing while German prisoners ate meat at every meal. The Holocaust happening while POWs bought ice cream. These contradictions are real. The decision to follow Geneva Convention standards was right, I would argue, but it wasn't easy or without cost. Acknowledging that complexity is important, we can recognize that American policy was legally correct and morally defensible, while also acknowledging the very real frustrations of American civilians and the suffering of American POWs in German camps. Both things can be true. Historical analysis requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. And fifth, stories like this need to be told. This isn't standard World War II history. This isn't D-Day or Midway or the fall of Berlin. This is the story of food, of daily life, of human experience in unusual circumstances. But it reveals truths about culture, policy, and human nature that the big battle narratives can't capture. The fact that most Americans don't know about the 425,000 German POWs in America is a failure of historical education. These stories matter. They complicate our understanding in productive ways. They show us that war isn't just combat, it's also logistics, law, ethics, and human relationships. And understanding war in its full complexity makes us wiser about when and how and why nations should engage in it. Here's what I want you to do with this knowledge. First, share this video. Send it to anyone who loves history, anyone interested in World War II, anyone who appreciates deep dives into lesser-known stories. This is the kind of content that deserves to be widely known. Second, if you're near a former POW campsite, and there were camps in most states, visit it. Many have museums or historical markers. Some have preserved buildings. Support these historical sites. They're documenting an important part of American history. Third, think about the principles this story illustrates. How do we treat people in our power? How do we balance justice and mercy? How do we maintain values under pressure? These aren't just historical questions. They're relevant to contemporary policy debates about prisoners, refugees, and enemies. And fourth, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because I'm creating an entire series on lesser-known World War II stories. Next up, I'm exploring the female pilots of the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program, WASPs, who flew military aircraft domestically during the war and were denied military recognition for decades. It's another story of complexity, injustice, and ultimate recognition that deserves an hour of your time. Before I close, let me circle back to where we started. 128 pounds to 185 pounds. 57 pounds gained, scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange juice, hot cakes with maple syrup, a dream meal. The feeling of being in a Hilton hotel. These weren't metaphors or exaggerations. These were real men's, real experiences, documented in memoirs and interviews and historical records. What you thought was maybe urban, legend, or internet myth turned out to be verified historical fact. German POWs in America during World War II really did experience shocking abundance. They really did gain dramatic weight. They really did have access to ice cream and Coca-Cola. And that experience really did change many of their lives and their understanding of America and democracy. History is full of surprising stories that challenge our assumptions. This is one of them. The story of bacon, eggs, and coffee, teaching democracy to German prisoners of war. The story of abundance, creating opportunities for denazification. The story of a 91-year-old man traveling across an ocean to say thank you for something that happened when he was 18. Thank you for spending a full hour with me exploring this fascinating historical episode. I read every comment, so let me know what surprised you most, what questions you still have, and what other World War II stories you'd like me to investigate. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into history that should be better known. Until then, remember, sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about battles and generals. Sometimes they're about breakfast.